There was a moment in Walter White's life where the walls around him started to feel smaller. The empire he'd built wasn't collapsing. Not yet, but the cracks were showing. The DEA was circling closer, his family was fracturing, and the one person who'd been with him from the beginning was starting to look at him like a monster. Before we start, I'd like you all to subscribe to my channel. Walt had power, yes, but what good is power when the person who helped you build it can't stand to look at you anymore? That's where his mind was every time he saw Jesse Pinkman pulling away. Because Jesse wasn't just a partner or a subordinate. He was a mirror, reflecting back everything Walt had become. And mirrors in Walt's world had a way of shattering. When Walt first approached Jesse, he wasn't looking for an equal. He was looking for a tool. Someone with connections to the drug trade, but without the intelligence to threaten him. Someone he could mold, control, and ultimately discard when the time came. Jesse was perfect for that role. A burnout meth cook with barely passing chemistry knowledge, desperate for relevance, hungry for approval from someone who believed in him. Walt saw Jesse's weakness immediately. The need to be seen, to matter, to prove himself to a world that had written him off. Walt could use that. In those early days in the RV, Walt wasn't teaching Jesse out of generosity. He was installing dependency. Every correction, every condescending explanation, every moment of controlled anger, it all served to establish hierarchy. Walt was the genius, Jesse was the assistant. That's how it was supposed to stay. For Walt, Jesse represented something he'd lost in his legitimate life: control. At the car wash, Skylar managed the money. At the high school, students ignored his lessons. Even in his own home, Walt Jr. looked at Hank with more admiration than he showed his own father. But with Jesse, Walt was the authority, the teacher, the one with answers. That dynamic fed something deep in Walt's ego, the need to be respected, even if that respect came from someone society had discarded. As their operation expanded, Jesse became more than just a cook. He became Walt's interface with the criminal world. Jesse knew the dealers, understood the streets, could navigate situations Walt's suburban chemistry teacher persona never could. When they needed muscle, Jesse found Badger and Skinny Pete. When they needed distribution, Jesse had the connections. Walt stayed in the shadows while Jesse handled the dirt. But Walt's use of Jesse went deeper than simple utility. Jesse became Walt's moral buffer. Every terrible decision, every escalation of violence, Walt could frame as protecting Jesse or cleaning up Jesse's mistakes. When they dissolved Emilio's body, it was because Jesse brought him to the RV. When they had to kill Crazy 8, it was because Jesse's distribution network led to that confrontation. Walt built an entire narrative where he was the responsible one, forced into terrible choices by Jesse's incompetence. This narrative served Walt perfectly. It allowed him to maintain the fiction that he was still a good man, a family man, someone doing what was necessary rather than what he wanted. Jesse's presence gave Walt someone to blame, someone to save, someone to feel superior to. As long as Jesse was the screw-up and Walt was the genius fixing his mistakes, Walt could avoid confronting what he was actually becoming. The problem with treating people as tools is that they remain human. Jesse wasn't the empty vessel Walt needed him to be. He had a conscience, morality, empathy, all the things Walt had systematically stripped from himself in the name of empire building. And those qualities kept surfacing at the worst possible moments for Walt's plans. When Jesse couldn't kill Gail Bedecker on command,
there's got to be some other way.
Walt saw it as weakness. But it wasn't weakness, it was humanity. Jesse understood something Walt had forgotten, that killing someone who'd done you no wrong, someone innocent of everything except being in the way, makes you a monster. Walt had already crossed that line so many times he'd forgotten it existed. Jesse hadn't. And every time Walt asked him to cross it, Jesse resisted. This resistance infuriated Walt because it exposed his own moral bankruptcy. If Jesse, the junkie, and screw-up could see that what they were doing was wrong, what did that make Walt? The genius who couldn't see it? Or worse, the genius who could see it perfectly and simply didn't care? Walt needed Jesse to be as corrupted as he was, needed him to cross every moral line without hesitation, because Jesse's reluctance held up a mirror to Walt's complete absence of conscience. The more Jesse questioned, the more controlling Walt became. When Jesse wanted out after the train robbery and Drew Sharp's murder, Walt couldn't let him go. Not because the operation needed him by that point, Walt had other options, but because Jesse leaving meant Jesse was stronger than Walt. It meant Jesse still had principles Walt had lost, and Walt couldn't tolerate anyone, especially Jesse, being morally superior to him. Walt's greatest weapon against Jesse was never chemistry or money. It was emotional manipulation. Walt understood that Jesse craved a father figure, someone to believe in him when everyone else had given up, and Walt exploited that need ruthlessly. Every "I'm sorry," every "I care about you," every moment of manufactured concern was designed to keep Jesse dependent, compliant, useful. When Jane died, Walt watched it happen. He could have saved her with minimal effort, rolled her on her side, but he didn't, because Jane was taking Jesse away from him. She represented Jesse's independence, his future outside of Walt's control. So Walt let her die, then used her death to manipulate Jesse for months afterward. He framed himself as Jesse's savior, the one who sent him to rehab, who gave him purpose again, who believed in him when he was at his lowest. That sociopathic calculation dressed up as mentorship. Walt knew exactly what he was doing. He was breaking Jesse down to rebuild him as a more compliant tool. And the truly disturbing part? It worked. Jesse came back more loyal than ever, more willing to follow Walt's lead, more convinced that despite everything, Mr. White cared about him. But manipulation has diminishing returns. Each betrayal, each lie, each time Walt chose his empire over over Jesse's well-being, the foundation eroded. Jesse started seeing the pattern, how every crisis in his life seemed to trace back to Walt, how every time he tried to leave, Walt found a way to pull him back, how Walt's concern always coincided with needing something from him. Jesse's presence in Walt's life served a function Walt never intended: witness. Jesse saw everything. He watched Walt transform from a desperate cancer patient into a calculating drug lord. He saw the lies to Skylar, the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened the Empire. He saw Gail's death, Mike's death, the poisoning of Brock. Jesse was there for all of it, accumulating evidence of what Walter White had become. And Jesse, unlike Walt, couldn't rationalize it away. He couldn't frame it as providing for family, or building something, or being the one who knocks. Jesse saw it clearly. They were poisoning communities, destroying lives, leaving bodies in their wake. And every time Jesse expressed doubt or guilt, Walt's response revealed his complete moral emptiness. Walt didn't argue they were doing good. He argued that Jesse should stop caring. This created an impossible tension. Walt needed Jesse close enough to be useful, but couldn't tolerate Jesse's conscience, reminding him what they'd become. He needed Jesse's loyalty, but resented Jesse's judgment. He wanted Jesse's obedience, but couldn't stand that Jesse still possessed the humanity Walt had sacrificed for power. The turning point came with Brock, when Jesse realized Walt had poisoned a child, not to save anyone, not to protect anyone, but simply as a chess move against Gus. Something broke permanently. That wasn't collateral damage or necessity. That was evil, pure, and calculated. And Jesse finally understood. Walt wasn't protecting him. Walt was using him. Had always been using him. Every moment of concern, every apology, every claim of partnership, all of it was manipulation in service of Walt's ego. Walt's decision to have Jack's gang kill Jesse marked the complete collapse of whatever had existed between them. It wasn't even personal for Walt at that point. Jesse had become a liability, a loose end, and Walt solved problems by eliminating them. The man who'd once claimed to care about Jesse, who'd called him son, who'd said they were partners that man-ordered Jesse's execution with the same casual ruthlessness he'd shown dozens of others. But Jack didn't kill Jesse. He enslaved him instead, chaining him in a pit to cook meth under threat of murdering everyone he cared about. And for months, Jesse existed in that hell, producing the blue meth that carried Walt's legacy, while Walt lived free, hiding in New Hampshire, still convinced he'd done what was necessary. The irony is devastating. Walt had spent years trying to control Jesse, to mold him into the perfect subordinate. And in the end, Jack accomplished what Walt never could: complete domination. Jesse was reduced to nothing but his function. A cook producing product. No opinions, no resistance, no conscience. Just a tool, which was, if we're honest, what Walt had wanted from the beginning. When Walt finally returned to free Jesse, it wasn't redemption. It was too late for redemption. The Walt who might have cared enough to risk something for Jesse had died long ago, replaced by Heisenberg, by Empire, by ego. Even that final moment, Walt throwing Jesse to the ground, shielding him from bullets, it wasn't love. It was Walt trying to write one last story where he was the hero, where he'd saved someone, where everything hadn't been for nothing. After Jesse, there was nothing left of Walter White except the Empire and the ego. Everyone who'd known him as a human being was gone. Skylar hated him. Walt Jr. refused to even hear his voice. Hank was dead, and Jesse was free but shattered. The only people left were those who'd known him only as Heisenberg. Walt had spent the entire series trying to manufacture respect, loyalty, love even. He wanted his family to admire him, his enemies to fear him, the world to remember his name. But Jesse, who'd given Walt all of those things genuinely at the start, ended up feeling nothing but relief when Walt died. That's the verdict on Walter White's life. The person who knew him best was grateful he was gone. If you strip away the details, Walt's relationship with Jesse reveals his entire pathology. Walt didn't want partnership, he wanted subordination. He didn't want loyalty, he wanted dependency. He didn't want to protect Jesse, he wanted to own him. And when Jesse's humanity kept interfering with that ownership, Walt escalated his control until there was nothing left but resentment and violence. This wasn't unique to Jesse. Walt did this to everyone. Skylar, Walt Jr., Hank, Mike. Anyone who challenged his narrative, who refused to see him as he wanted to be seen, became an enemy to be controlled or eliminated. But with Jesse, the pattern was most visible because it lasted longest. 5 seasons of Walt, slowly destroying someone who trusted him, all while claiming to care. Jesse was supposed to be simple, a means to an end, a useful idiot, someone Walt could use and discard. But Jesse remained stubbornly human, flawed, emotional, moral, in ways that inconvenienced Walt's plans. And that humanity, that refusal to become the empty vessel Walt needed, is what ultimately destroyed Walter White's carefully constructed mythology. Because Jesse survived to tell the truth. Not the story Walt wanted told, the brilliant teacher, forced into crime, the family man protecting his own, the empire builder who did what was necessary. Jesse knew the real story. A man so consumed by ego that he sacrificed everyone who loved him, destroyed everyone who trusted him, and called it providing for his family. Walt never understood what he'd done to Jesse, never grasped the magnitude of that betrayal. Walt still believed some part of their relationship could be salvaged. He wanted Jesse to acknowledge what they'd built together, to admit that, despite everything, it had meant something. But Jesse didn't give him that. Jesse didn't even look at him in the end. Because there was nothing left to say to Walter White. No closure that would matter, no explanation that would change anything. The man who'd claimed to care about him had turned him into a slave. The teacher who'd promised to help him had poisoned a child to manipulate him. The partner who'd called him son had ordered his execution. The title says Jesse destroyed Walter White, but that's not quite accurate. Jesse didn't destroy Walt. He revealed what Walt had always been underneath the justifications and rationalizations. Every time Jesse questioned their actions, he was holding up a mirror. Every time Jesse showed guilt, he was demonstrating what conscience looked like. Every time Jesse resisted, he was proving that choice still existed. Walt destroyed himself. He made every decision that led to his downfall. But Jesse's presence made those decisions visible in ways Walt couldn't ignore. Without Jesse there as a moral compass, Walt might have convinced himself until the very end that he was doing the right thing. But Jesse's horror, Jesse's guilt, Jesse's eventual hatred, all of it confirmed what Walt refused to acknowledge, that he'd become a monster. That's why Walt needed Jesse gone by the end. Not because Jesse threatened the operation by then, the operation was finished anyway, but because Jesse's existence was a reminder of who Walt used to pretend to be. The teacher, the mentor, the man who cared about something beyond himself. Jesse knew that man had never really existed, that Walt had always been capable of this cruelty, this calculation, this complete absence of empathy. In the end, Walter White's empire wasn't destroyed by the DEA, by rival dealers, or even by his own cancer. It was destroyed by the same force that had threatened it from the beginning, the possibility that someone might see him clearly and refuse to look away. Jesse Pinkman was that someone, and once Jesse stopped believing in Mr. White, stopped making excuses for him, stopped hoping he might change, Walt's entire mythology collapsed. Because empires built on lies need believers to survive. And Jesse finally stopped believing. Walt died with his precious meth lab, surrounded by the equipment that represented his genius. But he died alone, without family, without friends, without anyone who'd known him and still loved him. That's what Jesse's departure cost him. Not life, not freedom, not even the empire. It cost him the last person who might have mourned Walter White instead of celebrating Heisenberg's death. And that, more than any bullet or cancer or DEA raid, is what destroyed Walter White. The knowledge that even the person he'd tried hardest to control, to mold, to own, even Jesse Pinkman, would rather face an uncertain future alone than spend another moment in Walt's carefully constructed lie. Jesse didn't just escape Walt. He survived him. And survival, in the end, was the ultimate condemnation of everything Walter White had built.